Hey everyone, my name is William Schneider, and I'm the CEO and founder of New York Adventure Club, a social events organization based in New York City. I wanted to thank Eventbrite for the invitation to share my story today, as well as all of you for tuning in. So when I first moved to New York in 2011 from the faraway land of New Jersey, I joke I fell into the New York bubble. It's an overwhelming city. It's difficult to meet people, so I tended to stay in my comfort zone. And for that first year, my free time seemed to consist of restaurants, bars, and brunch. Between the monotony of my 9-to-5 corporate marketing job and not doing anything meaningful on the weekends, I had my early life crisis right on cue. So first, I realized I was kind of boring. I didn't do anything meaningful in my spare time. And second, supposedly it was the greatest city in the world, but I didn't know anything about it, even though I had been living here for a full year. So I made a self-pact that every weekend I would go out and do something, go somewhere, discover something new in the New York area. I wanted to be an expert in something and felt this pact would help me find what I was looking for. And for a year and a half, I kept up that pact. A typical weekend could include visiting historic landmarks, walking around a quirky neighborhood, or eating at a hole-in-the-wall eatery. I was having an incredible time and really appreciating the depth that New York had to offer. The only problem was that my core group of friends were never as interested. The idea of going to deep Brooklyn at 10 a.m. on a Saturday to visit an abandoned military fort was not their idea of fun. So I decided to create a Facebook group, invite them all into it without their permission, and curate a weekly newsletter showcasing interesting events coming up every weekend. I truly believe that if they came out just once on these weekend excursions, they'd be hooked. But unfortunately, it quickly became clear that I was speaking to myself in this group. So in 2014, I decided to give it one last shot. I figured that if I booked a private tour at an interesting place in the city, they'd have to come out since I had done all the work. But to hedge my bets, wary that they would actually come out, I promoted the tour in a local blog, hoping to rope in maybe 2 or 3 people so I didn't lose all of my money. And if this didn't work, then I was never going to try and pressure my friends to join again. And it was going to be my own personal, go on my own personal adventures. And when that blog went live, over 100 strangers joined the Facebook group asking how to get a ticket. And I was freaking out because I was at my corporate job, on a Friday afternoon, and all of a sudden I had to manage this craziness. But the only problem was that since I had expected only my friends to show up with cash, I wasn't selling tickets, nor did I even know how to. The first thing I did was go on Google and search how to sell tickets online. And fortunately, I stumbled upon Eventbrite, who I've used as my ticket provider ever since. New York Adventure Club remained a side hustle for 2 years until I was let go from my day job in 2016 due to company-wide layoffs. And instead of looking for another corporate marketing gig, I decided on making the club into my full-time job, my new full-time job, much to my parents' chagrin. Between my 3 months of severance pay and personal savings, I knew it was now or never to try and grow this business into more than a side gig. And the Monday morning after getting laid off, I got to work on ramping up New York Adventure Club. And fortunately, that's been my employer ever since. For the next 7 years following those humble beginnings, I dedicated myself to curating special access tours and events in and around the New York area, really geared for locals. New Yorkers are a really tough crowd, so I personally worked with every site location to ensure that the experience would live up to the hype and meet those expectations by New Yorkers. And leading up to COVID, we were hosting around 20 events a week for a community of around 15,000 people. And these events would range from a behind-the-scenes tour of a seltzer factory or a whiskey tasting inside a Gilded Age mansion, But soon after COVID, cases started rising in February of 2020. The city began to enact limitations on group sizes. And by mid-March, all of our scheduled events were canceled. All tickets were refunded. Meetings and calls about new adventures were indefinitely postponed. And for the first time since I had started the organization, my calendar was completely empty, which was actually really nice. It's nice to not have anything in my schedule. But beside that, in the days leading up to the full shutdown in mid-March, I started to think long and hard about where to go from here. And between waiting it out or trying something new in the meantime, I chose the latter as I didn't see this health crisis going away anytime soon. And when there were news reports of companies trying to create virtual content, the optimist in me saw an opportunity for New York Adventure Club to at least try out a virtual event, whatever that even meant. So the first challenge was creating a new brand identity. It's not every day you have to shift your business to a new industry that popped up seemingly overnight. While video content sites like Netflix and YouTube have been around for a while, the idea of a live event designed exclusively for online did not exist before COVID. Since there were no best practices or preconceived notions, the first question I asked myself was, what did I envision as a virtual New York Adventure Club event? And when I noticed local tour guides walking their tour routes via Facebook Live, I knew that I didn't want a virtual event that tried to substitute an in-person event. So many of our events were special because of what you saw and what you experienced in person. And trying to videotape that same experience would seem like a cop-out. So the question was, what was a valuable, worthwhile virtual experience? Behind each one of our events is an incredibly knowledgeable person or organization. So instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, why not just approach them and see how we could adapt our engaging in-person content for the virtual medium? And while we had a wide range of different event types, our lecture series was the lowest hanging fruit. Instead of presenting a slide deck on a projector screen for an in-person audience, why not just have them upload their presentation file and present it from their home? Most of the lecturers quickly signed on to this idea. And since the content and the promotional assets were already ready to go, we were ready to launch. We'd be ready, that is, once we knew what virtual event platform to use, which brings me to the next challenge of evaluating virtual event platforms. So even in the earliest days, Zoom was quickly becoming the darling for communicating in the virtual world. And while I'd been using it already for voice-only calls, I started playing around with its video features. And while it appeared to be a robust platform for video conferencing with a ton of advanced features, it didn't appear to be a good fit for the sort of events that I had in mind. First, it seemed overly complex for guests and presenters alike. I needed a platform with a simpler viewing experience. And second, you had to download it. I didn't want this extra step for people to enjoy any of our events. In hindsight, it turned out that everyone in the world would eventually adopt Zoom as their main platform, but in the early days, it wasn't a sure bet. And third, the virtual rooms could only be protected by a single password, which meant that one person purchasing a ticket could share the link and passwords with their friends, families, neighbors, pets, so on. Not to mention Zoom bombing, which took over. Since I wanted to charge for these webinars, ticket purchase integrity was a key feature. And fourth, it didn't have integrated replay capabilities, which would require me to upload a full replay manually after every single webinar, which I felt was out of my humanly capabilities. And fifth, the only way to share presentation slides and multimedia on Zoom was through a screen share. And being the type A personality that I am, and convinced that when technology can go wrong, it will, the idea of not having access to the same files in case of emergency was terrifying. I wanted these virtual events to run as smoothly as a television production. And after exploring the available virtual event platform options at the time, I landed on Livestorm, a web-based virtual event platform. And since our very first event in March of 2020, New York Adventure Club has conducted all of our events on Livestorm, and now it's a little over 1,000 at this point. While Livestorm isn't perfect, it still meets my specific needs all of these events later, even with a wide range of new virtual event platforms on the market. So with this webinar platform selected, I now needed to establish the order fulfillment flow so that guests who registered would be able to access the event without an issue. That brings me to challenge 3, the event infrastructure and fulfillment. So as an event organizer who's used Eventbrite since day one of New York Adventure Club's existence, I had to come up with a solution to have my chosen event platform talk to Eventbrite. So the process was automated. And unlike hosting an in-person event where guests would show up to the event location upon purchasing a ticket, a virtual event required us to send them the room. And while Eventbrite had a direct integration with some of the online streaming platforms like Zoom or Vimeo, Livestorm, unfortunately, wasn't one of them. However, both systems did integrate with Zapier, a third-party out-of-the-box API solution, which I'd only used up until that point as a way to add guests to a newsletter. And now Zapier would actually become a linchpin to make the entire fulfillment process work seamlessly. And after playing around with the systems, I was able to successfully get the Eventbrite page to send over the guest's information to Livestorm, which in turn would email the guest with their unique webinar access link. So my work was done. Well, actually, it wasn't even close, because it quickly became clear that while mostly everyone received the Eventbrite order confirmation email, a small but sizable population didn't receive it. And reasons for this included a typo made during registration, strict email spam filters, or misplaced email. A lot of emails go to spam and promotion folders. And on top of that, Livestorm didn't have a solution for the scenario of someone not receiving their link. So the only way for a guest to retrieve their own link would be to share the webinar room registration page in Livestorm, which would then allow them a backdoor access to the guest list free of charge. And as I mentioned before, preserving that ticket integrity was extremely important. So the solution devised with Zapier's customer care team was not to only pass along the guest's name and email from Eventbrite, but also their order ID, the unique identifier of that registrant's proof of purchase. And with this ID accompanying the guest's information in Livestorm, we could then create a Google form that a user could fill out to retrieve their access link. If the form found the entered ID, it would send the associated webinar access link to their provided email address. It was not a perfect solution, but a step in the right direction. And while this cut down on some of the inquiries of guests who read the confirmation email ahead of time, it didn't stop the surge of people reaching out within minutes of the event's start time for their webinar link. If there's anything I've learned in the nearly 8 years of being an event organizer, it's that people don't read. I've tried to approach any customer challenge with this fact in mind. And since the virtual event connection is much more complex, communicating clarity is key to reducing this customer frustration. And it actually wasn't until the very last month in April of 2021 that most of these fulfillment issues were resolved by doing 3 things. First, I revised the Eventbrite order confirmation to be crystal clear about the details surrounding the webinar access link. Second, I created a custom Eventbrite reminder for every single event with troubleshooting tips. specifically if they didn't get their webinar access link, what to do. And third, probably the most important, was toggling that last reminder email from Livestorm, which was sent out 5 minutes before, to HTML only, because emails with pictures are less trustworthy with email clients and more likely to go to your spam folder. So the solutions I just outlined are very specific to my particular needs, but hopefully it sheds a light on the sort of technical challenges that need to be addressed in order to create a smooth customer experience on the virtual side. With the order fulfillment process under control, the final step before launching our first virtual event to the calendar was setting a price. So I could lie to you and say that our virtual event pricing was chosen after weeks of analyzing our audience's price elasticity, but since I'm a bad liar, the truth is my gut drove most of the decision making. While I could envision people paying all sorts of prices to tune into a virtual event, I decided to look to important price points both internally and externally that already existed. Externally, I was now competing with streaming entities like Netflix and YouTube, which both offer endless amounts of virtual content for free or as part of a low-priced subscription. However, a difference with New York Adventure Club's content would be the live aspect and the interactivity of an educational virtual event, along with the duration extending over an hour, trying to hit that 75 to 90-minute mark. In my books, more time equals more value to a certain degree. Internally, I felt I had to price below our average in-person event range, which was $20 to $40 per person, since most people would find virtual events less valuable than a physical one. So, bouncing between $5 per person and $15 per person, I settled right in the middle at $10 per person as a fair ticket price for these sort of events, knowing full well that I'd have to sell a lot of tickets to make it worthwhile for both New York Adventure Club and the presenter. And to increase the value of the ticket and provide a second chance viewing opportunity for those who missed the live program, I decided to keep the replay enabled for a full week, which went against what most other event companies were doing in those early days of the pandemic. To make sure I wasn't setting myself up for failure, I asked several loyal New York Adventure Club members to see if that price was something they were comfortable with. Fortunately, they found it less expensive than what most other organizations were charging for virtual events, and more valuable than what they were watching for free. And once they greenlit the idea, the only way to test out that price point was to launch an event and hope for the best. And over 1 year later, all of our webinars are still $10 flat. However, we've started to add new types of events that include a physical component and therefore are more expensive. So one example is our spirit tasting series, whiskey tasting, tequila tasting, which include a tasting kit sent to the front door of anyone who signs up, granted they live in the lower 48 states. And even still, that $10 price point is still perceived as digestible. And while nobody complains of it being too expensive, there are calls from the members in the community for a subscription where someone can pay X dollars a month and have access to unlimited webinars. A subscription package is something that is being considered, but for now, New York Adventure Club will stick with a simple pay-per-view model. And as far as a final recommendation, I'd say do what you feel is right based on your audience. Every situation and organization is different, and I chose to go in a low price, high volume direction because I felt it was the best shot of seeing any success with the New York Adventure Club community. Which brings me to challenge 5, overseeing the virtual events. So now that we have all the infrastructure set up, now we can get into the management of it. And in the first weeks of launching virtual events to the calendar, New York Adventure Club had 1 event that week. And by the 3rd week, we had 5 events. And A month later, it was up to 3 events per day, 5 days a week. But it was at this point where my personal capacity was reached, because between my day-to-day work to move the company forward and overseeing each event from beginning to end and handling every single customer inquiry, I was at my humanly limit. I couldn't add any more events to the calendar. And the first solution to getting some of that burden off my workplate was to find others to moderate the events. We could be featuring the greatest presenter in the world, but if they accidentally hit the mute button and had the chat section hidden, then the event would be a total failure, and they wouldn't even know it until they finished. And without someone else in the room to provide support for both the presenters and the guests, the final result might be unwatchable, especially for those who decide to watch the replay. To find the first batch of moderators, I turned to the New York Adventure Club community for answers, as I usually do with anytime I'm having I need assistance. And after posting a request to my in my weekly newsletter, one step forward, and then another, and then by the week's end, fortunately, I had around 3 people who raised their hand. And so from that point, once I wrote a standard operating procedure that spelled out the protocols of this new virtual event model to ensure a well-run event, I was ready to start training them. And fortunately, these moderators exceeded expectations in every way possible. And since those early days, we've doubled our moderator count to around 6 people. Most of them acquired through referrals. And when it comes to finding reliable and responsible staff, my recommendation would be to first turn to your own existing community and audience, as these are the people that are most passionate about what you're doing. And when you do find some takers who raise their hands, put together a full tutorial that is as thorough as possible, so there's no room for confusion or misinterpretation. And that still happens until this day, where new problems pop up, and it's my responsibility to provide further instruction in those tutorials. And that guide features everything from what to do about disruptive guests to how to save a webinar when the presenter's computer malfunctions 5 minutes before the event, which has happened time to time. And over the past year, we've seen it all. So fortunately, our documentation had protocols on how to save the event and have it run as smoothly as possible. So now with moderators in place to oversee the events and the technical infrastructure working well enough, it was time to figure out how to accommodate larger audiences, which brings me to the next challenge of scaling up capacity. So when we had our first event with over 100 people in attendance, it was both terrifying and exhilarating. The best part was that it was fairly easy to manage. After all, we didn't have to rent a venue, spend hours of AV setup, get people to their seats, or even ask people to turn off their phones. And while that milestone was an exciting one, the bar rose every time we surpassed it, to try to break maybe 200 people, 300 or more. And after all, our webinars allowed for thousands of people to tune in live at once. But what challenges would appear with a larger turnout? And when we got our first event with several hundred people on the guest list, we quickly found out what some of those challenges were. First, even though we emailed people ahead of time with troubleshooting tips, we were still flooded with emails at the starting time from people who couldn't find their webinar access link. As I mentioned before, people don't read, so you can share all the tips you want, but the takeaway would be that to be prepared for that, and to be on standby for rapid fire customer support around each event to help those who were having technical issues or issues, of where their link was. Second, the chat section became a flurry of messages that were going too fast to read in real time. When you had too many people, it just got too overwhelming. And so for future events that surpassed a certain capacity, we decided to disable the chat section until the Q&A period. And that way people for the webinar focused on the content, but then afterward they could socialize, because having that ability to chat and share reactions is an important part of keeping a virtual event engaging. And fourth, given the event's size, more people than usual would need technical assistance. So, one tough aspect about virtual events is that everyone is working with different browsers, different devices, different internet connections. So it's not unusual for some guests to have issues during an event while others don't have a problem at all. And to troubleshoot these technical difficulties in real time for our larger events, we made sure to have an extra moderator on hand to assist guests as best we could. So as the larger that guest list got, the more hands on deck that we needed to make sure that everyone was helped out. And as any event organizer knows, until you've had the experience of running a larger capacity event than you're used to, you won't be able to predict every issue that arises. And if there's a problem with the order flow or tech during the webinar, you're going to hear about it from more people than you can handle, especially virtually, where if something's not working, you might get dozens or hundreds of emails in some cases. So my recommendation for this challenge would be to try and address pain points as quickly as they arise, so that you're not underwater with inquiries the next go around. And the seventh challenge is help along the way. So while having the moderators in place freed up time, everything else about the business, from the customer inquiries to creating event pages to marketing, still fell on my shoulders. And up until this point in my career, I've never had an assistant of any kind. My thinking was always, why spend the money on tasks that I felt I could personally do? But as each of our events started to bring in well over the 20-person guest list that I was accustomed to for our in-person events, it was clear that if I didn't find a solution to this problem, I'd be tethered to my computer 16 hours a day for the foreseeable future. And that's why my capacity was reached with 3 events a day. I would watch 3 events and have to do all this work around that, which was too much. It was overwhelming. So the idea of trying to find a true assistant was daunting and sounded incredibly time consuming. So how was I to find the perfect candidate? I decided to reach back out to a free service I had used many years ago called SCORE, which is the nation's largest volunteer business advisory program. And SCORE paired me with a business mentor who helped me think through my business challenges in great detail. In this case of being stretched thin, she recommended a website called FreeUp, an independent contractor marketplace that pre-vets all of their freelancers. And once I submitted that job proposal for the virtual assistant, selected my interviewee of choice, and finished working on my initial standard operating procedure that mapped out everything I did, I began the training process with her. And 4 months later, I'm still working with that same virtual assistant who handles everything from digital operation tasks to managing customer inquiries, which allows me to focus on the more important objectives to move the company forward. So my recommendation to all small business owners would be to have mentors and colleagues that you can run ideas by, big or small. And it's incredibly important to have a business support network so you can avoid feeling overwhelmed with each new challenge. In addition, there are many support groups online dedicated to event organizers during these virtual COVID times, such as the Coronavirus Response for Event Organizers group on the Guild platform. So taking a look at the future, it seemed that every couple of weeks throughout the past year, someone would email us asking when we planned to restart in-person events. And the official response was always sometime in 2021. But when 2021 finally rolled around, it was time to make some big decisions about the future of our in-person events, which had been in hibernation for over a year at that point. There are a lot of questions to ask with not a lot of clear answers. The first one most important one being, should I even restart in-person events? So when we pivoted to virtual events, our in-person event business didn't just slow down, it froze over. And since it was my responsibility to keep the business alive as its CEO, I went all in on virtual events, which was really our only viable option at the time. And what I didn't foresee was a product market fit that eventually resulted in the company earning more monthly revenue than it ever had as an in-person events business. And 1 year later, the difference in the company's bottom line is stark. So much so that business colleagues of mine have advised to follow conventional wisdom and focus on what's making the company money. In other words, don't go back to in-person events again. And while their arguments definitely had some valid points, I had to push back because I wanted to restart our in-person tours, first of all, for me and the countless others who had been enjoying these experiences for the past couple of years. I spent a lot of time and energy ensuring every in-person event was a meaningful experience. And to shut it all down just because it didn't make as much money would be somewhat of a betrayal to myself, the New York Adventure Club community, and New York City. But people have made their closest friends through the club, myself included. Others got more involved with the organizations that we visited on our events. Some even found their life partners on our adventures. In my opinion, in-person events are here to stay in some capacity, but what isn't clear are which ones. So which in-person events should I bring back? So pre-COVID, New York Adventure Club had around 20 events per week, ranging from 20 to 40 people on each event. And this month, we're restarting our outdoor in-person events with a limited frequency of 1 to 2 events a week for a maximum of 20 people for each group. So in addition, we now have guests agree to a set of COVID commitments before they can finish their ticket purchase to ensure the safety and comfort of both the guests and the guides. But New York is set to fully reopen at the end of May. So it's very possible that these internal guidelines change in the coming weeks as the city opens up and people feel more comfortable being around each other and others. Another important part of this equation will be what demand for virtual events looks like going forward. When the weather begins, or I should say when the weather began to warm up last month, we began to see a dip in turnout for these virtual events across the board. So is this a seasonal lull? Will attendance pick up when the summer weather gets too hot? Will people abandon virtual for good when life is back to normal, whatever that means? I can't predict the future, but for now, my focus will remain on virtual events with in-person events as the complement. So that being said, each in-person event will go through the, is it worth it filter? Is it worth running filter? As many events in the catalog were very expensive to run and saw a small return in the best case scenario. So why take these financial risks when I have another part of the business bringing in reliable revenue? These high risk, low reward events will have to be reevaluated to ensure that the in-person events coming back are only helping the business and not hindering it. And finally, we discovered that a number of our events can restart since some of those event partners are no longer in business, unfortunately. Also, some of the event partners simply don't want strangers in their space anymore. These external forces will limit the number of new and existing events that we can add to the calendar. And with all of this looming uncertainty, we'll be taking it week by week and periodically checking in with our event partners to see how they're feeling. But on a positive note, the couple of in-person tours that we have launched so far for May and June, many have sold out. So it's an encouraging sign that some people are ready to venture out in a group tour setting. So how will the business change to accommodate in-person events again? So for the time being, we're focusing on restarting the in-person events we already had in the lineup since they're all ready to go. If the virtual events remain popular and in-person events pick up across the board as well, then I'll have to determine how to best allocate my time. Will I have the capacity to create as many new in-person events? Will I have to delegate responsibility of them to someone else? The research and development of the in-person events relied on my personal involvement. So if we start to see interest surge, then getting help will be a necessity. So one decision we did implement due to the upcoming in-person events was reformatting our website to organize virtual and in-person into separate categories. This change was done to help people quickly find and browse the event types they're looking for, which in most cases will be one or the other, one being virtual or the other being in person. And the bottom line is that there are simply too many unknowns at the moment to make a large structural business change. But hopefully the landscape will clear up in the coming months. Time will tell what direction I have to take to ensure the prosperity of the business and the New York Adventure Club community. Brings me to the next question: which events are best for in-person, which are best for virtual? And the answer to this question is it depends. It depends on the event. But I'd argue that most in-person events can be adapted successfully into virtual ones. So a walking tour about a neighborhood can be expanded into a full webinar complete with historic photos and videos. A tea ceremony can be tweaked to have the instructors conduct the tea ceremony from their home. A whiskey tasting can be modified so the whiskey's mailed to your front door. These are different types of events and they should be treated differently. The question of whether one medium is better than the other is a moot point, since each has their own distinct audience. The people signing up for a walking tour are very different than those signing up for a webinar on the same topic. One person wants to physically explore a neighborhood, and the other wants to learn about a fascinating topic from the comfort of their home. And while there's sure to be crossover, I'll be focusing on giving each audience what they're looking for to the best of my ability. And on that note, I believe that in-person and virtual events of the same exact topic can take place simultaneously. Case in point, our popular webinars on Roosevelt Island and City Island, which were adapted to virtual for COVID and during COVID, are back on the calendar as both in-person and virtual events. And those two in-person events have sold out, and webinar interest seems consistent. So that proves the point that two audiences for two different mediums. However, one in-person event series of ours that will most likely bite the dust is our lecture series. And if you remember a couple minutes ago, those lectures were the lecture series was what helped to propel us into virtual events. But in pretty much every way, a virtual lecture trumps an in-person one. A virtual event can be, a virtual event can accommodate a larger capacity, can have instant replay capabilities. It's easier to manage, requires no expensive venue fees or AV needs, and it won't be ruined by someone forgetting to turn off their phone ringer. And the people enjoying our webinars are the sort of people who love in-person lectures. So it's highly likely these people continue to enjoy their virtual content going forward. And this is something we've heard firsthand from people who attend a lot of lectures that have really gravitated toward these virtual ones. So the big question is virtual here to stay? I believe they are, and that the opportunity to build out content for this new event medium is just beginning. If the lockdown had only been a couple weeks long, then I don't think the new industry would have stuck around. But since the entire world was forced to adopt online-based content, many have already discovered its advantages. Virtual events are extremely accessible. What's more convenient than having a front row seat to an event from your living room couch in your pajamas? It's hard to beat that. If your internet goes down or you decide to have an early dinner that night, you can just leave the event and watch the replay. And over half of our event registrants watch the program after the fact. And the programs can be viewed from anywhere in the world. This remote engagement with people from across the country and world wasn't possible in the pre-COVID days. This decentralized approach has also encouraged us to try out new types of virtual content, such as those spirit tastings with tasting kits sent to everyone's house. And for those sort of events, we've seen friends and family from different geographical regions sign up for these tastings as a way to enjoy a shared digital experience. And whiskey, of course. So going forward, New York Adventure Club is going to take a hybrid approach of hosting both in-person and virtual events with a focus on the latter. But time will tell what the balance will ultimately end up being. So my main takeaways from this workshop, even though the virtual event market has now been around for a year, it's still very much the wild, wild west. The best practices that I shared today, or I should air quote that, are specific to my organization and my community's needs. Event organizers are approaching virtual events differently, which in turn is creating varied audience expectations when it comes to content or the virtual platform. And this ambiguity creates a huge opportunity for event creators to try their hand at organizing an entirely new and engaging experience that can only be appreciated virtually. And for those final takeaways, virtual events shouldn't be viewed as competition or a substitution to your in-person events. Rather, they should be a complement to your existing catalog. This new event medium targets a completely different audience. And by hosting both in-person and virtual events, you'll encourage crossover between the two. And if you have an existing business, explore how you can utilize the same systems, event partners, and other business components to accommodate virtual events. A pivot is only possible if you have existing infrastructure, which you can tweak to create a new product or service. So third, it's very important that you find the virtual event platform or platforms that fit your business needs. It's not about choosing the best platform or what people say is the best. It's about choosing what the right webinar platform is for you and your company. There's a ton of options out there now. So if you're bound to find one that has the core features you're looking for. And I need to do this myself, as we have different types of events that aren't best suited for live storm, and could be better served on a different platform. So I need to get on it myself. I have to follow my own advice. And this technology overload is confusing to most customers. So try and simplify the process as much as you can. And the goal here is to just reduce the number of customer inquiries you receive to as little as possible. And as I mentioned before, it's when you have a 20-person event versus a 500-person event, your customer inquiries are just going to be so much larger. So the more you can get ahead of it, the less emails you'll get. And on top of this technology, prepare for it to fail on you. We've had every tech situation you can imagine, from a presenter's computer dying 5 minutes before the webinar, to a guest who can't see the slides even though everyone else can. The more you can document these issues and build in redundancies to mitigate the problem, the more reliable your virtual events will be, which will in turn encourage guests to trust your brand. Don't be afraid to ask for help either. Every event organizer and business owner needs mentors and colleagues who can offer helpful business suggestions, even if those recommendations aren't ultimately implemented. So SCORE, CREO, two organizations I mentioned before, are resources that I use. But there are many others. The important thing is, to not do this alone. And you don't have to be alone. There are a lot of other people. Everyone's figuring this out at the same time. And lastly, I would recommend that every event organizer think about how they can accommodate standalone virtual events or add a virtual component to their existing in-person event. Because not everyone who's interested in your on-the-ground event will be able to attend it on that specific day at that specific location. So why not try to bring a taste of that experience to them? So if you made it this far, I wanted to thank you for tuning into my workshop today. Whether you've tried out some virtual events in the past or haven't launched any yet, I hope today's webinar will encourage you to explore the new medium in new and creative ways. I hope to see all of you on a future New York Adventure Club event, virtually or in person. So thanks, and have a great weekend.